and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Resilience, Resistance, and Revolution, Lessons on the Influence of Adversity and Diversity in Hamilton the Musical, presented by Dr. Loretta Brady. Sorry about that. St. Anselm College is committed to keeping its alumni and friends engaged by partnering with our centers, institutes, and departments on campus. And our alumni, we will continue to offer webinars, podcasts, and other opportunities to stay connected. And it is thanks to many people who have offered their experience, expertise, or suggestions on a topic. I would encourage you to contact the Alumni Relations Office if you have any suggestions for future programs. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the college's website for those who couldn't make it live today. Dr. Brady will speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit a question or multiple. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Loretta L.C. Brady, PhD. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, writer, and professor of psychology at St. Anselm College. She received her doctorate from Fordham University. She serves on the boards of several task forces and local nonprofits. Her award-winning writing has appeared in New Hampshire Business Review, Business New Hampshire Magazine, and she has been a source for the New York Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post on issues related to workforce development and resilience. Dr. Brady's literacy agent is Ladderbird Literacy founder, Beth Marcia. Her career includes the Fulbright Fellowship and McNair Fellowship. She lives in Manchester, New Hampshire with her family. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Brady.
Thank you so much, Skylar, for the introduction and for your time today. I want to thank the Alumni Office at St. Anselm College for the invitation, both to today's presentation, but even more relevantly to the invitation to present back in, I think, academic year 2015-2016, which is actually the origin point for today's presentation. So I'm coming at you live from my basement. This is my remote teaching classroom existence. My family and I have a big family, and we thought it was important our kids get out the door this academic year. So I'm teaching from home. So pardon the amenities. You may notice, in addition to the art, some paint cans in the back. So, you know, it's just a little flair, a little personality. But I'm really glad that I get to be with you, however that might look in this new way that we're living. And in this new way that we're living, I live with other people, so you might hear them. So pardon me, it's not because I don't want to be here or give you my full attention. It's just that we had 3 people leave our house for the first time since March 13th today, and they got to be with other humans kind of their age, so there might be a little energy above me. But at any rate, back in 2015, alumni had been doing some hilltop travel series and had said, you know, Hamilton's all the rage. What do you got? We get some thoughts there. And I actually had a lot of thoughts. That academic year, I was teaching a special course in a special topics course called Risk and Resilience. And at that moment in time, as Hamilton, the narrative, the musical narrative, and as Alexander Hamilton's life itself became more and more in our national spotlight, I began to be drawn to Alexander Hamilton and kind of the psychobiography work around him. So there you have it. My interest in my own scholarship, looking at risk and resilience, my students' work in the classroom, trying to understand some of the psychological and physical health impacts of adversity, particularly childhood adversity. And then this national moment of an amazing musical that brought to life this very vivid American founder. So what I'll present today is very much that alumni hilltop travel talk way back in 2015. But since then, I've actually revisited this topic a few different times. And in, I believe it was 2017, I presented at New England Association for American Studies and presented a formal academic paper that originated out of this Hilltop Travel series. So a little bit of a backdoor. Oftentimes Hilltop Travels are focused on scholarship that the faculty have already done. And at that point, I was just sort of entering into that conversation. So now I can look back and and situated in the context that we're in now in 2020 as well, and be able to bring in some new threads that have sort of come about over our past kind of 18 months and the election cycle that we find ourselves in. So I'm gonna shift to, I think now you won't see my face, which is okay. You're gonna see some slides, and you'll see that first slide from back when this was an alumni talk. So I think that worked. And yeah, back then, you know, Hamilton was just on Broadway, so we were all still really trying to get seats. In fact, that was one of the barriers to whether or not we would even be able to pull off that hilltop talk, was whether I could actually get to see the show or not to make these links. Fortunately, we were able to pull that off, and I was able to see the show. And as I began to dig deeper into both Lin-Manuel Miranda's motivations behind producing this story, as well as Rob Chernow, the biographer whose book Alexander Hamilton captured Lin-Manuel Miranda's imagination. As I dug into both of their interests and motivations around this figure, I learned even more about the figure and the influences that had sort of made him so charismatic and have such a resonant draw for us even these centuries later. I think that some of those, that opening song, if you've had the opportunity, whether through Disney Plus, being able to see that live broadcast, or back before we had that access and we maybe were relying on the White House presentation of I think it was a 2013 or 2012 dinner, and Lin-Manuel Miranda was there presenting for the first time the one song about Alexander Hamilton that he had at that point. But in that first song, as a kid in the Caribbean, I knew that I was poor. That line really resonates in that first song, and it resonates for Alexander as well. As I dug into some of the past, what we call psychobiography research, I learned that his poverty and the particular way that that poverty manifested in the context that he found himself in as the son of a woman who'd already had a child and who'd had a broken relationship, and who was outspoken about her rights in a time and a place where that wasn't allowed. His poverty meant a lot of things, and it didn't just mean that he was hungry, right? That it meant that he didn't have access and he didn't have legal rights to some opportunities that he otherwise might have. And in my research, that cluster of things that could go wrong for a little child are called adversity or adverse events. And in early in my career in the late 90s, early 2000s, this area of research really started to expand. We started to have a lot more science and health information about not only that those things that occur in childhood could be damaging, but that those things that are negative that occur could actually have lifetime health impacts. So even if the particular need might be met, you know, a child is put back on a path, whatever their needs are attended to, they're no longer neglected, they're no longer abused. The fact that those events happened at all can set their physiology up for chronic health conditions later on. And so in Miranda's score and in Alexander Hamilton's life itself, we can see how that early adversity, that early poverty experience really set a stage, right? It set a stage for some specific kinds of negative outcomes, but it also set a stage for some certain types of qualities that Alexander himself was perhaps forced to cultivate because of those circumstances. In moving to this here, what you're seeing in the term ACEs that's used on this slide stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so this is a whole set of an area of research that has really come into its own in the past 2 decades, to the point now that even here in New Hampshire, we have a nationally recognized program that was based on this model that really recognizes that children who maybe witness extreme violence or have some kind of a crisis within their home environment, that they may need extra support. So here in New Hampshire, we have a responsive team that was developed in order to help law enforcement respond to those kinds of crises in family homes. What you're seeing in this information here is just that, these aren't uncommon life events, right? When we talk about childhood adversity, many people experience childhood adversity. And of course, any one item here doesn't predict a terrible outcome for anyone, but we recognize that there's a special awareness we need to have that any of these events in a child's life can be a vulnerability that they face later on. When it comes to Alexander Hamilton, he had a lot of those vulnerabilities. Parental loss is in fact one of the adverse events. There's sort of 10 critical events that are recognized. Just to pop back up this slide here, these 10 critical events are recognized as having a particularly strong influence on later health and psychological well-being. And when we consider Alexander Hamilton, we recognize that not only did his father abandon the family, and it seems to be related to his own frustrated ambitions within the social class that he had to operate in. But not only did Alexander experience his father's abandonment, he also, of course, experienced his mother's early death as a result of, I think, the flu, actually, but I'm not sure. And then, the family that would have stepped in and supported was clearly struggling themselves and committed suicide. So those social, or what we call that kind of social ecological part of his life, was very fractured, very disrupted, right? And that's going to be a critical detail to remember later on, the number of attachment disruptions that he had to navigate very early in his life. That is going to come up again and again in his life. And then finally, that island storm, that hurricane. If you've seen Hamilton or heard the score, that hurricane song is a particularly powerful one. And in the theatrical presentation, it's just beautifully choreographed so that you really feel like you appreciate his moment of decision that is being displayed in that scene. But that hurricane is pivotal for a few reasons. And we've talked a lot here about adversity and the hardship that can happen early in one's life. And that storm was certainly a hardship. But that storm was also the opportunity that came into Alexander's life. It isn't clear whether, if that storm hadn't happened, whether he would have gotten the rest of the opportunities that help us know who he is. So it's a really pivotal adversity because he reported on the storm. One of his gifts, and this truly is a gift, and it seems that it may have come from his mother, is his way with language, right? That he is a storyteller, he's a writer. He had always apparently had that capacity. And early in his adolescence, after this storm, he made a record. He wrote an article for the paper, and it caught the imagination of his island. The elite, who of course would have been reading that publication, really rallied around the sentimentality and the evocativeness with which he described both the beauty of their island as well as the destruction that it had sustained. And so it was that skill, that storytelling capacity, and his ability to with sentimentality convey his love for that place that captured the imagination of the elites, who said, okay, we got to get you passage to the States so that you can get educated in the way that they understood proper education to be. So adversity, certainly, lots of hardship, lots of things that set him up for some difficult outcomes, and then also some incredible resilience, right? Some credible skill that he had that was able to be leveraged for his benefit. This slide is conveying just that combination of negative events had a likelihood of having a physical impact for him. We know that individuals who have a number of childhood and early life traumas tend to have more chronic health problems and more severe mental health or addictive challenges. And so this is conveying that reality. What we get presented in Hamilton the musical And what's presented in Chernow's biography of Hamilton is that he ages a little bit more quickly than some of his peers. There's some language and narrative both in his own writings and in Hamilton's own writings, and then in writings of Hamilton that reference the rapid aging that he experienced after his son's death. And so we can kind of point to some of these earlier life events and recognize some of those physiological changes. The allostatic load is how we refer to aging. It might have been very high for him, and there's some evidence that that may have been true. So it was, in fact, that writing, and not only his writing, his storytelling, but his ability, despite his early disruptions, Alexander was very adept at building relationships with people. And he certainly didn't always have positive relationships, as we see presented in the musical. Some of those relationships were very fraught, but they were enduring, right? He makes an impression on people. He seeks to make connection and to engage. That's a talent, a gift, a quality that he really brings with him. And it does seem to contribute to the opportunities he's able to avail himself of. The fact that he was able to be conscientious and really detail-oriented made him very helpful to his mother's landlord, which made it possible for him to get a few years of existence out that probably wouldn't have been possible if he had been a different child. When we as clinicians, as psychologists, as those of us who try to create interventions to support communities, when we look at what communities need to be resilient, we recognize there's a host of resources that are required. It's not just the individual child's capacity to form a relationship or to be charismatic, but it also is a fact that the environment they're in needs to be able to meet some basic level of need in order for them to engage with their own character skills that they may bring. And for Alexander, he brought with him, as he's transitioning from his island experience into his colony experience in the Northeast, we see that he is really coming as an outsider. And one thing that outsiders come with is the ability to think in a way that is different from the people who have kind of already been part of the scene, right? So we call that being a divergent thinker. And convergent thinker is someone who has the ability to string together some strong arguments and kind of put point A in front of point B and then communicate to point C. And certainly Hamilton had plenty of those skills, but he also was really intuitive. He really understood when there was an opportunity, when the moment seemed to be right to make a certain move, to leverage a certain relationship. And that really does come from the experience that he probably had and that he describes having in some of his writing of being an outsider, even early in his life. That outsider status is going to be an Achilles heel for him, but it starts out really good. And here, we're just depicting in Manuel's story that hurricane song, where that falls in the score, just what that represents for Hamilton in that moment, really encapsulates both his strengths and his vulnerabilities. He has enormous strengths, and a psychologist in 2018, I believe, wrote this book called Supernormal, and she wasn't intending to write about Hamilton. However, what she was attempting to write about was identifying what key qualities were associated with individuals who were particularly resilient, people who had endured incredible adversity, but were, despite that, functioning at very high professional and social levels. And this individual, so she, Meg J, I believe her name is, she wrote Supernormal, as I mentioned, I think 2 years ago. But this list comes out of her work. And it's a great list because I look at this and I say, okay, so these are all the qualities that someone, if they have any of these qualities, this is going to put a point in their resilience bucket. And then I look at these qualities and I say, okay, and thanks to Schuyler, I can say this with confidence, he had all of them, right? He had all 10 qualities. He was charismatic, he was self-confident, he was intelligent. And even in Manuel's depiction of Hamilton's life, where we see a really concentrated view of the particular personal animosities between Hamilton and Burr, even in that dynamic, you see that that animosity wasn't because he wasn't admired, right? If anything, that animosity was particularly there because he was an admired individual and because he did have so many positive qualities. And, you know, it would seem then, with all of these things going for Hamilton and with evidence professionally of the success that this $10 bill actually represents, right? He was never president, but he still gets to be on the money because he created the Treasury. It's why we have money, and why our colonies were able to, you know, climb back from the Revolution. His ability to understand the potential and the power that creating the Treasury would generate. That's that divergent thinking in action, right? And then his success in getting that deal closed, you know, come hell or high water, he was really determined, right? 58 Federalist Papers, and then from there, even more determined around the role of what the Treasury should do. That ability to leverage those relationships and see that pattern that comes, I think, from his adversity, from that outsider status, from having to recognize patterns and opportunities in a way that an individual whose existence was more secured may not have developed, right? May not have used his intellect in that same way. So I think he probably always would have been bright and smart and ambitious, but I think there's something about the way that he applied that that is unique to his earlier life experiences. However, despite being a very functioning and successful individual, he did have some areas where he was vulnerable, right? And in the musical, that lyric, he looked at me like I was stupid. I'm not stupid, right? We can link this to something that Miranda writes about learning called honor culture. There was one text that Miranda cites heavily in helping him prepare for Burr's character, and that was a text written about honor culture and dueling in the 1700s. Honor culture isn't unique to the 1700s. It's not even unique to America. But when it's present, it means that folks in that community, and in this case, men, are going to be, a lot is going to be on the line for them if their name is impugned. And that is something that was true for Hamilton, right? So not only was he a man in a culture that had an honor culture, but he also was a man who was not perceived as an outsider among his group, right? So here he is running the Treasury, operating at a very high level, of course, but we know that he's seen as an immigrant. He's seen as an outsider by the men that he's negotiating power with. And that combination of being someone who's seen as an outsider and being someone who is tuned into the value of his own reputation and knows that that really is all he has. He doesn't have other status that he can rely on, right? Part of his move and desire to be in the military was his recognition that socially, military rank meant something. It would open doors professionally. It would give him access to the resources he needed. And so he knows that. And so that's a frustration, and it's a vulnerability, right? So later on, even when he's more secure and more certain about his credentials and knowledge, that doesn't ever go away for him. And that's still going to be a sticking point, as we know. This slide, at the time in 2015, I had just come back from a Fulbright fellowship in Cyprus. And this is a place that does have a pretty strong honor culture. Cyprus is a nation in the Mediterranean and historically has sort of been an international pawn, right? It's situated right off of Syria, right off of Israel, right off of Turkey, right off of Europe. A lot of Greek Orthodox as well as Turkish Cypriot community. And they had several decades of conflict in 1974 that came to a particular head, where now the island, still from 1974 on, has been divided. And the northern portion of the country has been settled by and occupied by Turkish military force. Turkish Cypriots live there, as well as Turkish settlers and many expats from across the globe. And then the remaining portion of the island, Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus, which is the whole island, is predominantly Greek and Turkish Cypriot, but predominantly Greek Cypriots are living in that portion. So my family was living right along that line. We were living in Nicosia, and I was teaching at the University of Nicosia and conducting research there on the clinical treatment opportunities for treating trauma and addiction. As a nation that has had a great deal of military conflict, there's a high prevalence of trauma exposure. So I was there to support some capacity building. And that capacity building was useful. At the time I was in Cyprus, there was an economic crisis. The banks closed for 3 weeks, and everything after that really changed as far as what sorts of resources the national infrastructure could pull from. But that capacity building work was really helpful because they were able to sustain their drug treatment policy work that they had done as a result of some of that effort. And as this relates kind of back to Hamilton and lessons of adversity and diversity, I guess I'll just end our formal portion of our conversation by pointing out the ripple effects of small decisions, right? I don't know what was in Hamilton's mind when he chose to write that story about the hurricane and the impact it had. But obviously that small decision had a huge impact on the rest of his life and of course on ours. And similarly, these moments that we face in the cycle that we're in, we have opportunities. We have small decisions we get to make right now, and they're going to have ripple effects for all of us. And I think that when we recognize what our early life foundation has planted, both for the strengths that we can pull from as well as for the little vulnerabilities, Hamilton's story for me highlights the power of knowing what our vulnerabilities are during these kinds of moments. Because I think about the pandemic that we are all navigating right now, and I recognize how uncertain the future can feel for so many people. And I think that, at least in Miranda's portrayal, and I think in the biography details that I've been able to uncover, even in Hamilton's own writings, I think that Hamilton appreciated his vulnerabilities, but maybe not understood what was driving him, right? I think a lot of times Hamilton's story is seen as someone who just couldn't get enough, right? Too ambitious, couldn't get enough. And I look at Hamilton's story and the details that I've been able to piece together, and I see someone who was looking for wholeness. If I look at what he did with the Treasury, if I look at what he did with some of the machinations politically that he was able to maneuver, oftentimes he was doing that in order to bring together something that had been really fractured. And for me, that's the lesson of Hamilton's story. Small decisions have big ripples, and whatever those little vulnerabilities might be for us, they're often the seeds that drive us towards where we direct our energy. So as you are being perhaps pressured in this pandemic moment, maybe a lesson that you can take from Hamilton is to pay attention to what those seeds are. Some of them might be little booby traps, so tune in. And in doing that tuning in, keep your focus on that big picture of what that ripple could possibly positively impact, and know that you have that opportunity. So I'll stop my screen share. That means, unfortunately, you're going to see more of me and less of these slides, but I guess that's the deal. And I understand that there might be some Q&A, so I'll let Skylar into the conversation.
Hi, if there's any questions that anybody has or any comments, you can put it in the Q&A at the very bottom of your screen and just type it in, and Professor Brady will go over her answer for it.
Thank you.
In the show, who was your favorite person that was portrayed?
Sorry, had muted myself. I That is a very tough question, Kyle. Thank you. Or Kylie. Um, uh, it's hard not to love Hamilton himself, right? Of course, Miranda's portrayal of Hamilton. I really thought that George Washington and the portrayal of George Washington was really powerful. I was very fortunate to see it when that actor was still in the cast. And I just thought his presence and the way that he just projected, and I don't know that he was projecting what Washington really projects or what Hamilton projected onto Washington, but I just thought that portrayal was really powerful. And then Renee Goldsberry as Angelica, right? She's just she really draws you in, I think.
Did you find it hard to empathize with any of the people being portrayed?
Mm. In reading Chernow's biography, one of the things that I was really struck by was how much more I liked Eliza and the women in Hamilton's life, right? That in relying on Chernow's depiction, there's just such a thinness to how he discusses women at all, right? It's just sort of like, oh yes, Hamilton had a bunch of affairs because his wife was always pregnant. I mean, that's not what he says, but that's, if you skip ahead several chapters and paragraphs and you put it together, that's kind of one of the points that he's making. And I think that's not it. I just don't think that it's just that. I don't think that that's even a respectful explanation, but certainly that knowing what Eliza was able to do in her lifetime beyond her years when Alexander was alive, there was so much more to their relationship than I think Chernow was able to communicate. So I do think that in Miranda's portrayal, that's something that I really appreciated. I wouldn't have come away with that same level of appreciation, even though Chernow does write about Eliza's important work. It is, something that Miranda pulls from in his score. I just think what Miranda is able to do and what the actors are able to do in that story is really powerful.
Another question is, do you think Miranda Seeds, with his upbringing in Puerto Rico and the natural disasters there, had an impact on his bringing this into musical to life?
Yeah, well, I definitely think his appreciation for what hurricanes can do, right? Like I do think, this was of course before Hurricane Maria, and that giggle wasn't me making light of that, but just, if you live on an island, you understand like nature in a very different way than if you don't live on an island. So I certainly think that that's a piece of it. And I do think that outsider piece, right? I mean, even within our most recent, I think the RNC convention was the end of August, and there was a speaker, Kimberly Guilfoyle, who is Puerto Rican, and her mother is Puerto Rican. And she described it in such a way to make it sound like it wasn't part of the United States, which it is. Right. And so even here today, like I think that experience often happens for folks who are Puerto Rican, that they're read and interpreted as not American. And so I think that gives an outsider status. So even though there isn't an outsider status, right, you're American, it's received in a certain way, and particularly in the New York City area, right, it can be received in a certain way. So I think that had an influence for Miranda on how he portrayed and thought about Hamilton.
Like to relate to Hamilton a good amount.
Yeah, exactly. And he writes and has spoken, Miranda has spoken about how when he was reading Chernow's biography, and I don't know if you've seen this biography, I don't have it next to me, but it's like thick, and he got it in an airport and took it on vacation with him, which like that's just the kind of person he is, so that's good. But it's a beast. And he said as he was reading it, he was imagining all the drama as a rap battle, that these were rappers who were battling for position and credibility and street cred. And so, he definitely is filtering everything he's experiencing through the lens of things that he cares about, right?
How did Hamilton's relationship with Washington and Jefferson help his resilience?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. So of course, father figure stuff with Washington, um, and recognizing though that father figure stuff for Hamilton is really complex because he was abandoned by his father, but his father was alive and he had a sibling who was being cared for. Like, right? Like, so all these really hard things that are happening to Alexander, like, they weren't necessarily happening to his sibling. And I think he had a half sibling as well. And so I think that makes him come into the relationships that he has with male mentors, of which Washington clearly was, in a different way than if his father had died or if his father had abandoned him but not had any kind of long-term connection with him. I also think that there's different points in Alexander's kind of professional journey where that relationship is more or less resonant, right? But I think in our portrayal with Hamilton the musical, that just seems like it's the only relationship, and I think it was much more complex for Alexander than only that. Like, I think he had a lot more relationships than only Washington, but of course that was a very pivotal point of influence.
What about Jefferson? That was also in your question.
Yeah, right. So I think there was a lot going on with Jefferson that Hamilton was bringing in the room, right? I think there's a whole kind of subtext maybe in the musical. It's not subtext in Chernow's work, where Hamilton had some strong feelings about slavery and enslavement and what was just, and understood very clearly that Jefferson's wealth and what he was able to be doing professionally was a result of his holdings of slaves. So I think that was a factor in how they interacted and sort of the positions they each took. I don't know what the connection between that and his earlier life, other than that he was exposed to the reality of enslavement very intimately, right? Working at the harbors, working in the ports. He was, part of what he was keeping track of rum and sugar, right? And everything they had on board. He understood what enslavement was as a business and what the dehumanizing conditions really were. And his own mother had been imprisoned in a way that was really dehumanizing. And so I think he was informed in those ways. I don't know that it was the kind of maybe a sibling type rivalry, the setup of Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton perhaps, has us thinking about, if we think about Washington as sort of a father figure mentor. I don't know that the kind of tension between them was really just about a sibling type rivalry, right? I think there was more kind of ideological differences for both men.
What do you think about Hamilton's relationship and the understanding of the women in his life, such as like his wife or Angelica, Maria Randalls?
Yeah, I think this is why one of the reasons I appreciated Miranda's portrayal of Eliza and Angelica and Peggy and of, I don't know, that woman with the beautiful voice she's the bad girl. What's her name? I can't remember the character. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah,
anyway.
I forget it as well. Sorry.
Yeah, the one, I can't say no, that song, whatever. Reynolds, right? Mariah Reynolds. So I enjoyed that portrayal that Miranda gave. I do see his affair with Mariah Reynolds, which is maybe not quite the question, but I want to get to that, and then you can ask me the question again, because I think I lost the thread. But I think I see the affair with Mariah Reynolds as a way, even though it's threatening his marriage, so not giving permission and not excusing, but I understand those actions as a way of him seeking unity and wholeness, right? That there is a way that he can be with Mariah that he cannot be with Eliza. And I don't mean that just in a sexual way. I think there's a status that he can display with Mariah that he doesn't display with Eliza. And I think that at the moment that affair happens, is particularly meaningful, right? And that's what I mean by those seeds of vulnerability, that, you know, he's had attachment disruption, he's under a great deal of pressure, and it's threatening the status that he has been able to attain, and it's threatening at that point his entire life's work, right? He'd just written those 58 papers or whatever, contributed to those 58 papers. So I think all of those pressures at that moment, and him not having anyone in his life that he could simply be Alexander with, and not this high status Alexander that he had become, I think that's part of what that affair was about for him. But I don't know if that was the original question, so if it wasn't, you can correct
I was
me.
just understanding the relationship between his wife, along with Angelica and all the women,
Yeah.
including his
Yeah.
husband. So
I know that Miranda took some liberties in the narrative with Angelica and Eliza and Peggy. And so that in the actual facts, Angelica had already been married by the time she meets Alexander. And that, you know, it wasn't really a question of whether she was ever going to be with him at that point. I don't know what the relationship with Peggy, the younger sister, was. I know that she had an early death, so that was meaningful. But yeah, that's kind of all that I have about their.
So somebody brought up the fact that history does repeat itself. So much of the work of developing the American Republic was polarizing and decisive. So Federalists versus Republicans. Any lessons that you have for the election of 2020
Well,
based off Hamilton?
I guess I can't quite remember the 1800 election, but I know it was not like a great model for us to probably follow, I think. I'm not a historian, just to be clear. I'm a psychologist, so I'm coming at it from this very, very clear perspective. I think for any system, including our American system, to be resilient, we need to be able to focus on the strengths that we have. And so it's hard to do in an environment where, you know, what might seem like a really straightforward decision for one's own health or safety is somehow a political decision. But even with that being an environment we might navigate, anything we can do to highlight the ideals that are highlighted in this story, right? The ideals of unity, of being able to be part of something bigger than ourselves, of being able to shape and fit the resources and the policies we have to the demands that we actually have before us, right? I think that's what we're called to action around. And I am not naive to how challenging that might be.
So those are the questions that we've had so far. If there's any more, feel free for anybody to jump in there and ask something.
Well, I wanted to ask a question to Meg or Patrice of alumni events, and I don't want to make them come on to speaker if they don't want to, so they can type in the chat and I can read their answer. But you know, what was it about this talk that kind of seemed right for this moment, and what are some things that you're taking away from our talk today?
I actually brought this up when we were thinking about the webinars, and with Disney Plus bringing Hamilton into so many living rooms or family rooms this summer, and it having a revitalization of the conversation, I felt, why not see if we can get Loretta back and bring it on? And I think that there's so many things that, you know, the cast has been on so many shows talking about their experience with the show and their how they resonated with their characters. And so I thought it would be interesting for our alums. I also didn't get to see the play, so I watched it on Disney Plus, and I loved the musical, but I also loved the ending and how Eliza was given her due, and was wondering what you thought about whether she was going to be an influential person without him or not, or is it their marriage that made an impact?
I don't think I have enough source material on Eliza as a young woman to know kind of what she would have been like for anyone's, as a partner for anyone, right? Because in her world, that was the source of women's power, was who they were partnered with, right? So I think in her world that would have been true. She would have been a devoted partner and a strategic partner, I think, for anyone. But I can't anchor that to anything specific because I don't know enough about her early life. I can say that I think those qualities that were on the slide before the $10 bill, those 10 qualities that come out of Meg Jay's work, I can't imagine loving someone like Alexander, losing them early, and knowing what they contributed, knowing that no one understood or fully appreciated what they contributed, and not want to do something about that, right? Like, so I think it's the combination, right? I think Eliza comes into this all on her own and has her own unique skills and passions. And then I think she was married to Alexander Hamilton. Like,
that rubs off on a person.
yeah, right? Like, you kind of get who you're married to. And I think she knew like who she was married to, right? I think she knew and really deeply appreciated the wonderful aspects of him. So I think I don't know, exactly why she was able to be as effective as she was, but I do agree with you that that's something I really appreciate about Miranda's work. And something about the Disney Plus production that I didn't appreciate in the New York production that I got to witness was the poignancy of Eliza's last note, right? That sort of reaching out and the gasping. And I know there were some Twitter debates when that was first airing as to whether or not that was good or not. I know Philippa, who played Eliza in that production, said, I just went with it. Every night it was a little different, and that night, that's what it was. But I just thought that little poignant ending on the Disney Plus version was interesting because I hadn't picked that up and perceived that when I saw it live myself. So. Well, I just really appreciate being invited, and I want to thank you so much for thinking enough of this Hilltop talk to invite it back. So.
Thank you very much for agreeing and spending your time with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Skylar, and thank you, Meg.
There's somebody who in the audience is saying thank you very much for sharing your perspective.
Yeah, awesome.